Welcome to the Lost Sci-Fi Story channel. If you're ready, let's begin today's story.
The atmospheric particles of Ionis Prime had been carrying the same information for 300 years. The Empire is stable, the bloodline holds, the augmented see all. It was the kind of institutional confidence that got inscribed into the very air of a civilization. And on most mornings, Princess Vaelthari found it either reassuring or mildly suffocating, depending on how well she had slept. On this particular morning, she had slept for 4 hours and 20 minutes, which her neural interface had logged, assessed, and quietly flagged as suboptimal before she had even opened her eyes, because the augmentations of the Vaelthari royal bloodline did not believe in allowing a person the simple mercy of waking up gradually. They believed in data. They believed in it continuously and without interruption, which was an excellent quality in a governance system and a genuinely terrible quality at 6 in the morning. She lay still for a moment on the sleep surface of her private chamber, which adjusted its pressure fields around her with the attentive silence of something that had been engineered never to inconvenience her, and let the incoming probability streams settle over her consciousness, the way a person might let their eyes adjust to light. The Eastern border negotiations had a 71.3% likelihood of stalling by midweek. Senator Vaelthari was planning to introduce a budget amendment that he had not yet told anyone about, but which 3 of his staff members had discussed in a corridor that happened to be networked. The crystal towers in the 4th Administrative District were exhibiting early resonance fatigue and would require structural intervention within the next 11 days. The Vaelthari ambassador had filed a formal request for a follow-up meeting and had used the word partnership 7 times in the filing, which her augmentations flagged as either a sincere diplomatic overture or a man who had learned one word in Vaelthari and was committing to it fully. She got up. The chamber around her was already adjusting, lighting shifting from sleep spectrum amber to the cooler frequencies her augmented eyes preferred for the first hours of wakefulness, the ambient temperature climbing 2 degrees to the value her biological systems had preferred since age 19. When the full suite of royal modifications had settled into their permanent configuration. Everything in her world was calibrated to her. It was the great luxury and the quiet strangeness of being what she was, a system so thoroughly optimized that inconvenience had been almost entirely engineered out of her existence, which meant that, when inconvenience arrived, she was always somewhat unprepared for it. The diplomatic reception the previous evening had run from the 7th hour to well past the 11th, which was not unusual for events involving the Vaelthari ambassador. His name was Councillor Dreven Orath, and he was a large man by his species standards, with 4 arms that he used expressively and a vocal range he apparently considered a gift to everyone in the room. He had opinions about trade tariffs in the way that certain planetary systems have opinions about orbit, completely, and without the option of deviation. Sale had stood beside him for the better part of an hour while he explained, with genuine passion and extensive hand gestures, why the current shipping lane agreements were structured in a way that was, and she was quoting, cosmically unfair in a way that transcends mere economics and enters the philosophical. She had nodded, she had smiled. She had, in the privacy of her own neural interface, watched the probability stream suggest that nothing he was saying would result in a signed treaty, that the reception would run 40 minutes over, then 60, then longer, and that the most likely outcome of the evening was a mutual expression of goodwill that committed no one to anything, which was the diplomatic equivalent of a very expensive dinner that solved nothing. She had been right, as she almost always was. She was also very tired. She dressed without assistance, which was a preference her household staff had learned to accommodate without comment after she had, early in her reign, explained to them with great patience and only marginal exasperation, that she was augmented beyond the biological limits of nearly every species in 11-star systems, and was therefore probably capable of managing her own fastenings. She stood at the curved window of her chamber while the sky over Ionis Prime did what it always did at dawn, filled gradually with the soft luminescence of the atmospheric network coming online, particles catching the first light and refracting it in ways that to unaugmented eyes looked simply beautiful, and to her eyes was also a constant, faintly humming feed of imperial data. She was reading the morning's border assessments and thinking about the ambassador and his feelings about shipping lanes and also, somewhat tangentially, about the cup of stimulant tea she intended to have as soon as she reached her private office, when her maintenance console chimed. She sat down. The update notification was already open, palace security clearance codes arranged neatly across the top of the interface. The green verification banner present and familiar in the way of things that have been present and familiar for so long that they have become invisible. She was thinking about the Threnosi ambassador. She was thinking about the tea. She was thinking, in the way that even the finest minds occasionally think when they are tired, and it is early and nothing in the last 1,000 repetitions of a task has ever required them to think about it very hard, about almost nothing at all. She pressed accept. The console confirmed the update with a small, pleasant chime. Outside her window, Ionis Prime continued its morning. The probability streams flowed on, steady and full, telling her everything about the world except the one thing she would have needed them to say. The phrase, "the princess clicked the wrong button," had, by the fourth day, achieved the kind of cultural velocity that Sale had previously only observed in market crashes and particularly memorable diplomatic scandals. It was in the open corridors of the palace. It was in the commercial districts of the capital, where the atmospheric network carried public information feeds that anyone with basic augmentation could read, and anyone without could access through the public terminals that lined the market thoroughfares like patient, glowing sentinels. It had apparently made it to at least 3 of the outer systems, because a border governor named Thassel, who was either very loyal or very bad at reading a room, sent her a personal communication expressing his sympathies, and included, seemingly without irony, a suggestion that she might consider a more rigorous cybersecurity briefing for her household staff going forward. Sale read this message twice. Then she set it aside in a folder she mentally labeled correspondence to never acknowledge, and moved on with her morning, which was already going poorly enough without the addition of governance advice from a man whose primary administrative achievement had been once successfully rerouting a supply convoy. The Imperial Council's meeting request arrived on the 5th day, phrased with the elaborate courtesy that powerful people use when they want to do something impolite, and would prefer the architecture of the language to obscure this. Matters of governance continuity was the phrase they had landed on, which was impressive in its way, 3 words that managed to simultaneously imply that there was a problem with governance, that it was a continuity problem, and that the problem was possibly Sale herself, without technically saying any of these things. She confirmed the meeting for 2 days out, which gave her 2 days, which was not enough time to solve anything fundamental, but was sufficient time to understand the room before she walked into it. She spent those 2 days doing something her augmented self had rarely needed to do with this degree of deliberate intention. She talked to people. Not the probability stream version of talking to people, which had always been somewhat like consulting a very sophisticated instrument that happened to have a voice. She would input the conversation, extract the weighted data, discard the uncertainty and the noise. She talked to them the slow way. She brought her senior trade advisor into her office and asked him what he actually thought about the Threnosi frontier situation. And then, when he began his standard briefing format, told him she meant what he thought rather than what the briefing said, and watched him spend a full minute recalibrating before he produced an opinion that was more interesting and considerably less certain than anything he had ever formally submitted. She did this with the fleet logistics coordinator. She did it with the head of the intelligence division, a woman named Vess who had the eyes of someone who had been waiting her entire career for someone to ask her what she actually thought, and who, once asked, had to be gently redirected after 45 minutes because she was thorough in the way of people who have spent years being told to summarize. Orvith observed all of this from her position as the gravitational center of the palace's administrative function, and said nothing, which was Orvith's way of saying quite a lot. She did, on the second evening, appear in the doorway of Sale's office at half past the 10th hour to find Sale at the desk with handwritten notes spread in an expanding radius around her, a stylus in one hand, and the focused expression of someone solving a puzzle they have decided to take personally. Orvith looked at the handwritten notes. She looked at the 17 networked strategic displays along the walls, all of them active, all of them offering to do precisely what the handwritten notes were doing but faster and more comprehensively. She looked back at the notes. "You're writing with a stylus," she said. "Yes," said Sale, "on physical material. It helps me think." Orvith surveyed the room with the expression of a person who has made peace with the universe being strange, but still feels entitled to register the strangeness. "I have," she said, 17 fully networked strategic display systems in this room. Any one of them could cross-reference everything you're working on simultaneously and present the results in a format that—" "Orvith, yes. Go get me more paper." There was a pause of moderate duration. "Of course," said Orvith and left, and returned 4 minutes later with a supply of physical writing material that she set on the desk with the precise, neutral movements of someone who has decided that this is simply the situation now and has begun adapting accordingly. The council meeting, when it arrived, had the atmosphere of a room in which everyone had prepared something they intended to say, and was waiting for an opening that would allow them to say it without appearing to have prepared it. There were 5 of them, arranged around the council table with their augmentation arrays active. She could see the faint light of their interface nodes, the micro-movements of eyes tracking data streams she could no longer see, and they greeted her with the careful warmth of people who had not yet decided whether she was someone to manage or someone to fear, and were hedging against both outcomes simultaneously. She found, to her mild surprise, that she preferred this uncertainty in them to the precise social calibration her augmented self had always generated automatically. At least the uncertainty was honest. Counselor Meave, the eldest and most politically durable of the 5, a woman who had served under Sale's mother and had survived 4 major governance crises through the application of strategic patience and excellent timing, opened with the expected framing. Continuity, stability, the Empire's need for augmented leadership at a moment of external pressure. She said none of this in a way that was technically insulting. She also said none of it in a way that was technically about anything other than removing Sale from active decision-making, which was the trick. Sale listened to all of it, without the probability streams telling her exactly how this conversation would resolve. She had to listen in the complete way, not for data points, but for the thing underneath the data points, the current of intent running beneath the surface of the words. She was discovering that she was quite good at this. She was also discovering that she probably always had been and had simply never needed to use it. She let Meave finish. She let the silence that followed sit for a moment, the way a person lets a stone settle before crossing a river on it. Then she said, "The Threnosi border situation." Not a question, a direction. Meave acknowledged it. "The frontier acceleration," she said, was precisely the kind of pressure that required the Empire's full strategic capacity, which was a sentence that contained no specific word that was unkind about Sale's current condition and communicated nothing else. "I'm going to invite Counselor Oreth to Ionis Prime," Sale said, "for dinner." The 5 of them processed this. She watched it move through them the way a signal moves through a network, arriving at each node, being assessed, being compared against expectations, producing a result. The result, in all 5 cases, was some version of the expression a person makes when they have misheard something and are not yet ready to admit it. "For dinner," said Counselor Wren, who was the youngest of the five and had not yet learned to fully suppress his reactions. "For dinner," Sale confirmed. "The ambassador whose government is currently—" "Yes, during an active frontier." "Yes." Ren looked at Meave. Meave had put on the face she used when she was doing political mathematics at speed and did not want anyone to see the working. The other three had varying expressions that shared a common quality, which was the quality of people watching someone do something they cannot yet determine is brilliant or disastrous, and finding the uncertainty genuinely uncomfortable. Sale gathered her handwritten notes from the table. She had brought them intentionally, and had watched all 5 pairs of augmented eyes register the fact of them, with a reaction she had found informative and stood. "I'll need communications access and a formal invitation drafted by this evening," she said. "Orvith has the format." She moved toward the door. Then she paused and turned back and looked at the 5 of them with the unhurried steadiness that had been hers before the augmentations and was hers still. "I know what you're planning to draft," she said. "Take your time with it. I find I'm very interested in what you'll actually write when you've decided what you think I am." She left them to it. Behind her, through the closed door, she could not hear what they said. She didn't need to. She had, after all, always been quite good at reading rooms. She had simply forgotten for a while that this was its own kind of knowing. Counselor Drevin Orath arrived on Eonis Prime on a Tuesday, which was, as far as anyone in the Empire was concerned, an entirely unremarkable day to arrive. He came with a delegation of 4, which was smaller than protocol suggested and larger than a private visit warranted, which meant he had made a deliberate choice that split the difference between the two and committed to neither. A move Sale recognized as the work of a man who was paying attention. She met him at the reception threshold personally, without ceremony staff, without the formal augmentation display that Vaelthari royalty traditionally used to open diplomatic engagements, which involved a coordinated activation of interface nodes that was functionally a demonstration of exactly how much the royal host could perceive that the guest could not. She met him the way an ordinary person meets another ordinary person, standing, present, without theater. Orath stopped when he saw this. His 4 arms stilled. He looked at her for a moment with the expression of someone recalculating a journey after discovering the map was drawn for a different territory. Then he said in Vaelthari, which he spoke well but carefully, "Your Highness, you look different." Sale said, "I've had a complicated month." He said, "I read something about that." She said, "Everyone did, please come in." They ate in a room that was small by palace standards, which still made it large by most other standards, and Orath's 4 arms gradually relaxed over the course of the first hour, in the way of a person who had been braced for something that was not arriving. She had not prepared a diplomatic framework. She had not prepared probability-weighted conversational approaches or optimal outcome matrices. She had prepared, in the most literal sense, dinner, and had asked Orvith to ensure it included the specific grain-based dish that Threnosi culture associated with informal trust, a detail she had found not in the network feeds, but in a physical cultural reference text she had pulled from the palace library, which Orvith had located after 40 minutes of searching, because apparently no one had accessed it in 11 years. 11 years, Orvith had said, setting it on Sale's desk. "The last person to check this out was your mother." Sale had looked at the text for a moment. Then she had said, "She always set better tables than I did," and moved on because there was work to do, but she had thought about it afterward, in the quiet spaces between tasks, in the way that certain things settle into you sideways when you are not defending yourself against them. Orath talked honestly. She had expected it might take longer to get there, had prepared for the longer version, but the absence of the augmented social architecture that usually surrounded Vaelthari royalty seemed to have removed something he had been pressing against for years. He was frustrated with his own government. The hardline faction had used the perception of Vaelthari weakness, and here he paused, glanced at her, and said, with the careful phrasing of a diplomat who has decided to be direct but has not entirely forgotten that he is a diplomat. The reports of your situation, to sideline him on the frontier escalation. He had not authorized the territorial acceleration. He had been informed of it. There was a significant difference, he said, between those two things, and he was tired of the difference being invisible to the other side of the table. Sale listened to all of this, not for the weighted fraction her augmentations would once have extracted and filed. She listened to the whole of it, the uncertainties and the frustrations and the specific bureaucratic indignity of being the person nominally in charge of a policy you think is catastrophically short-sighted. And when he finished, she said, "My council is currently writing proposals to remove me from active governance on the grounds that I'm no longer augmented enough to rule effectively." Oreth looked at her. She continued, "So I understand something about being nominally in charge of a situation you didn't design and don't endorse." There was a pause. Then Oreth made the sound his species produced instead of laughing, a low resonant hum that his four arms joined in the particular rhythm Sale had once read about in the cultural text and now heard for the first time in person. And something in the room shifted in the way that rooms shift when two people have stopped performing at each other and started actually talking. The border agreement took 6 days. It was not clean. It left both sides with concessions that each would have preferred not to make, and it contained 3 clauses that Sale's probability streams, had they been functioning, would almost certainly have flagged as structurally fragile and recommended renegotiating. She knew this because Thevan Sorrel, who had apparently decided that his role had expanded from royal physician to general commentator on her decision-making, told her so after reading a summary. She told him she was aware of the fragile clauses. He asked why she had accepted them anyway. She said, "Because Oreth needed something to bring back to his government that looked like a win, and I needed something that would hold for 5 years, and those two things required each other." Thevan Sorrel considered this. Then he wrote something in the small personal log he had apparently been keeping since her augmentation failure, which she had noticed and chosen not to ask about, because some records should be allowed to exist privately. The Imperial Council submitted their 3 reform proposals on the same morning. The Threnosi border agreement was formally ratified, which was either very poor timing or the kind of timing that was not accidental at all. Sale read all 3 in sequence at her desk, with a cup of stimulant tea that was, for once, the correct temperature. The proposals were thorough. They were also, in their different ways, all variations on the same architecture. A ceremonial role for a bloodline princess whose augmentations could not be restored. Real governance distributed to a council of augmented regents. The form of the monarchy preserved while the function was quietly redirected. She set all 3 aside and picked up the letter she had drafted 4 nights ago, the one she had signed with the unhurried precision that had always been hers. Addressed to the full council and requesting a formal hearing for a new governance framework. One that did not require augmentation as a prerequisite for authority, that separated the legitimacy of rule from the technology of it, that reached back before 600 years of augmented monarchy to find the architecture of something older, and she had begun to think, more durable. She had shown the letter to Orveth before drafting it. Orveth had read it twice. Then she had said, "This is going to be the most difficult thing you've ever done." Sale had said, "I know." Orveth had said, "The probability of success is not favorable." Sale had said, "I know that too. Do you have more paper?" Orveth had given her more paper, which was the closest thing to a declaration of loyalty that Orveth's particular personality produced, and which Sale had understood as such. She submitted the letter. The council's response arrived within 2 hours, which meant they had been waiting for something from her and had prepared for multiple versions of it. The hearing was set for the following week. Senator Vaelthari introduced his budget amendment the same afternoon, apparently having decided that this was a good moment for it, which it was not. but Sale was beginning to accept that the Empire contained people who would make poor timing their defining characteristic regardless of what she did. And this was simply a feature of governing rather than a problem to be solved. On the evening before the hearing, she stood at the window of her strategy chamber in the dark, looking out at Ionis Prime. The atmospheric network was active, as it always was, particles carrying the Empire's information through the night air, glowing faintly for the augmented eyes that could read them, which hers no longer could. She had stopped reaching for the probability streams 3 days ago. Not because she had given up on them returning, Thevan Sorrel had not entirely closed that door, had in fact opened a small cautious window of long-term possibility that he'd immediately warned her not to place too much weight on. But because she had noticed, sometime in the last week, that she had stopped feeling the absence as loss and started feeling it as a different kind of space. A space in which things were uncertain, and she had to work with other people and write things down with a stylus and listen to the full 45 minutes of what Vess from intelligence actually thought. And none of it was optimal, and all of it was, in its own resistant and inconvenient way, alive. Behind her on the desk was the hearing brief, handwritten, 12 pages. Beside it was a cup of tea at exactly the wrong temperature, because she had forgotten about it while working, which was the most ordinary thing she had done in years and which she found she did not entirely mind. Outside, the Empire continued. It did not know yet what it was going to become. Neither did she. She thought about her mother, who had set better tables and checked out cultural reference texts, and governed through a version of this same uncertainty that Sale had never had to understand before now. She thought about Orath and his 4 arms and the grain dish, and the 6 days of imperfect agreement. She thought about Seth, the junior advisor who had almost spoken in the wrong moment in the strategy chamber on the first day, and who had sent her, 2 days ago, a formal memo containing an idea about the frontier resupply routes that was genuinely good. The kind of good that required knowing the ground rather than reading the streams. She thought about all of it, the whole slow, handwritten, over-temperature shape of the last 3 weeks, and turned from the window, picked up her stylus, added one more line to the hearing brief. She did not know the odds. She found, standing there in her own unchanged hands in the dark of a world she could no longer read from the air, that she was perfectly willing to find out.